Chapter 1. The Death of Sound Philosophy. Kant's great discovery, but one that he never admitted to, was that apodictic reason is incompatible with knowledge. Such a reason must be transcendental. This is a word that has been propagated with enthusiasm, but only because Kant simultaneously provided a method of misreading it. To be transcendental is to be free of reality. This is surely the most elegant euphemism in the history of stern philosophy. The critical philosophy exposes the truths of reason as fictions, but cunning ones, for they can never be exposed. They are big lies to the scale of infinity, stories about an irreal world beyond all possibility of sensation, one which is absolutely incapable of entering into material communication with the human nervous system, however indirectly, a separated realm, a divine kingdom. This is the ghost landscape of metaphysics, crowded with divinities, souls, agents, belligerent subjectivities, entities with a zero potentiality for triggering excitations, and then the whole Gothic confessional of guilt, responsibility, moral judgment, punishments and rewards. The sprawling priestly apparatus of psychological manipulation and subterranean power. The only problem for the metaphysicians is that this web of gloomy fictions is uncoordinated, and comes into conflict with itself. Once the fervent irrationalism of Inquisition and the stake begins to crumble, and the dogmatic authority of the Church weakens to the point that it can no longer wholly constrain philosophy within the mold of theology, violent disputes, antinomies, begin to flourish. Due to the internecine strife of the metaphysicians, polyglot forces begin to be sucked into conflict, at first mobilized against particular systems of reason, fighting under the banner of another. But eventually a more generalized antagonism begins to emerge, various elements begin to throw off the authority of metaphysics as such, skepticism spreads, and the nomads begin to drift back, with renewed elan. Kant's critical philosophy is the most elaborate fit of panic in the history of the earth. Its more brutish, and even more consequential, ancestor was Luther's hysterical reaction to the disintegration of Christendom. A kind of intellectual paralysis, the basic symptom of which was a demand for rigorous and consistent austerity, was common to both. Like Luther, Kant was forced into conflict with an institution steeped in tradition with which he would have been happier to conform, if only it were strong enough to keep the barbarians at bay. But whilst atheists, such as Hume, threatened to wash everything away, the Pope spawned bastards and Christian Wolfe pontificated absurdities. There was only one answer: revolt in the service of the establishment, and the revolt, once begun, was carried through with a steel dedication. What was also common to both of these reluctant rebels was the renewed vitality that they breathed into the antique institutions they engaged. Within a few years of Luther, the Jesuits, after Kant, Hegel, Catholicism and metaphysics both reborn. After all, fear is the passionate enthusiasm for the same. In speaking of modernity, we acknowledge that an insatiable historicization has befallen the earth, a shockwave of obsolescence has swept away all perpetuities. Far from escaping the frenzy of abolition, thought has been sublimed in the white heat of its outer edge, functioning as the very catalyst of history. What is new to modernity is a rate of the obsolescence of truth, although it is still, as I write, possible for a good idea to last longer than an automobile. It is natural enough, therefore, that critique is an instrument of dissolution, a regression to conditions, to the magmic power of presupposition, upon which all order floats. Cultures that become critical are rapidly intoxicated by lavish metamorphic forces. Reality becomes soluble in the madness of invention, such that it seems as though critique were luring nature into our dreams. Anything is allowable eventually, as long as it is extravagant enough, and nothing that is allowable may any longer be avoided. A critique only dates in the way capital does, cunningly. Both are names for metamorphosis as such, reproduced in their own substitution. To describe Kant and capital as two sides of a coin is as necessary as it is ridiculous. A strange coin indeed that can synthesize a humble citizen of Königsburg with the runaway reconstruction of a planet. Yet any attempt to render such an absurdity intelligible enmeshes us in the critical machinery that will always be associated with Kant. If counterbalancing the dominant mass of the real with transcendental philosophy is deeply unjust, to which tribunal shall we appeal? To one that is more universal, a transcendental move. Or one that is more ontologically profound, a theological idiocy. Hegel sought to treat Kant with a sense of proportion, and his failure in this regard is also ours. This is why every variant of modern thought exhibits a complexion of retardation, critique, and aberration, since if it does not inertially resist the seduction of modernity's critical resources, it is torn between the twin lures of harmonizing with them, or venturing into the expansive obscurities beyond. Philosophy, comprehending all theory, has no socio-historical pertinence for us other than its relation to Kant. In the case of Buttill, such a relation is superficially obscured by the prevalence of references to a Coggivian, Hegel, but two obvious points can be made here. Firstly, the Hegelian text is nothing other than a response to the predicament of transcendental philosophy, so that all of its terminology is operative from the start within a Kantian register, and secondly, Buttill's philosophical vocabulary, regardless of first appearances, is in fact, and independently of Hegelian mediation, fated to address a Kantian inheritance. A preliminary sample might include sovereignty, a Kantian problematic before becoming a Hegelian one, the thoughts of limit, the crucial difference between immanence and transcendence, a long unknown, possibility, objectivity, and end, as well as, and above all, with its critical usage. The importance of Hegel to Buttill is not immediate. It stems from the character of Hegelian thinking as a redemption of Kantianism, its attempt to save transcendental philosophy from the lethal spasms welling up from within. Irrespective of his own immensely confused intellectual project, Buttill's reading of Hegel is a regression into the nihilistic momentum of critique, into a thanatropism which Kant largely misconceived, and which Hegel attempted to speculatively excise. Hegel's philosophy is the life support machine of Kantianism, the medical apparatus responding to a crisis. When Buttill explores this machine, it is not primarily in order to understand its inherent potentiality for malfunction, but to excavate the euthanasia it prohibits. Hegel's reading of Kant is complex and multifaceted, but also of an unprecedented coherence. Its intelligibility is, in the end, coterminous with the possibility of a system of reason, or actual infinity. Hegel realized that the Kantian conception of infinity, which abstractly opposes itself to finitude rather than subsuming it, indefinitely perpetuated a dangerous tension, insofar as it ascetically suspends the moment of resolution. This bad infinity, the endless task of perpetual growth, capital, is incapable of ever diminishing the prospect of utter collapse. Kantian infinity is deprived of any possibility of intervening in developmental series, leaving them vulnerable throughout their length to the catastrophic collision with the limit, loss of faith, war, the eruption of an incomprehensible death. Kantian infinity is given, whereas Hegel sets to work. It is only a banal claim of Hegel's own thinking that history has no greater objection to offer than the profound immersion in his work. Unlike the exposition such Neckarft receives within Hegelian self-understanding, however, this is not primarily because there is no depth of servility or wretchedness to which the spirit of the system refuses to descend, but is rather due to the fact that the comprehensive voyage of experience that traverses such depths has as its condition of existence the uttermost abandonment of real independence. The filthiness and ignobility of Buttill's writing follows immediately from its being steeped in Hegel. This is not to suggest that such baseness is coherent with Hegelianism, in any of its variants, for however immense the powers of reflexive self-comprehension exhibited by such thinking, the supremely vicious character of intimacy with the Hegelian text cannot be grasped within it. Investment in the system is not itself or relation internal to the system, and to make it so is merely to offer a hypocritical apologia for its degradation. If Hegel's prostitution to the Prussian state can become speculatively intelligible, this is only at the cost of an etherealization which, in itself, is consummate abjection, deceit, and travesty, or, put succinctly, definitive humanity. This is not to provide the justification for a dismissal of Hegel. Hegel remains strictly unintelligible to us, and any claims to the contrary are anemic tokens of bourgeois apologetic. Insofar as Buttill depends upon the overcoming of Hegel, he is an inanity. That Hegelianism is a sad farce of the Academy decides nothing as to its eventual sense, and if postmodernity depends upon a decision in respect of Hegel, it is a culture of accommodation analogous to Hegel's own crude response to Schelling, or to the even more devastating oblivion of Schopenhauer's thinking within the formative phase of 19th-century German metaphysics. The internecine conflict between germinal possibilities of post-Kantian thought is appropriately judged by a laughter whose measure is the preponderance of capital within modernity. It is as comic as the hatred Trotskyite sects bear for each other as they squabble over the management of a future whose probability slides asymptotically towards zero. A dialectical illusion is the error, exposed by transcendental critique, through which reason pretends to the transcendence of itself. It is associated, on the one hand, with an objectivistic interpretation of the intellectual forms of a representation as independently existing structures of things in themselves, and, on the other hand, with an attempt to grasp the subject as if it were an entity separable from its own operations, the latter being a mistake that Kant entitles paralogism. Descartes' ontology of extended and thinking substance exemplifies both of these errors. Such dialectic is the object of critique, and is always a confusion between conditions of possibility and their products. Kant describes this confusion as one between conditions of objectivity and objects, which in Marx's case are producers, labor power, and commodities, in Heidegger's being and beings, in Derrida's writing in The Sign, etc. Such confusions misconceive the transcendental as the transcendent, performing a gesture that can be described as metaphysics, fetishism, ontotheology, logocentrism. For but ill it is the effaced difference between utilization, expenditure, and utility which bears the brunt of critical aggression, engaging an error to which he gives the uncompromising label reason. Profane thought, reason, interprets making use of in terms of usefulness. It thus loses all sense of absolute end, the transcendental condition of value. To repeat Kantianism, modern thought, is to perpetuate the exacerbative displacement of critique, but to exceed it is to cross the line which divides representation from the real, and thus to depart both from philosophy and from the world that has expelled it into its isolation. Critique is a matter of boundaries, or the delimitation of domains of application for concepts. It is inherent to critique that a terrain of unthinkability is delineated, or that limits are set to the exercise of theoretical endeavor. The Kantian name for the items within the legitimate field of theoretical cognition is phenomena, whilst the extraterritorial items are called noumena or things in themselves. Because the noumenon escapes the categories of the understanding, which include modality, we can neither say that it is possible nor that it is impossible. Noumena are what escape the competence of theory, being those things which are unknowable in principle. That, therefore, which we entitle noumenon must be understood as being such only in a negative sense. The most influential attempt to establish a new coherence between conception and its outside is Hegel's, in particular his phenomenological solution to the delineation of experience. Hegel argues that the boundary of experience is produced by the inherently self-transcending character of reason, so that the discursive excess which is exhibited, for instance, in the word noumenon expresses the negativity or freedom of spirit in relation to its content. Spirit is not confined by the difference which restricts or determines phenomenality, since it is itself its auto-differentiation. The outside of spirit at any moment of history is merely its own unreclaimed, alienated, work. This is not merely to collapse Kant's thing in itself back into the phenomenal world, because Hegel does not think of spirit as a timeless, transcendentally pre-given, system of cognitive faculties, in Kantian fashion, but as a historical auto-production, in which the self is really, and not merely reflectively, determined by the logically orchestrated content of thinking as and through time. Hegelian history is not formal but speculative, which means that the subject is developed and not merely expressed, through the series of predicates by which it is thought. Hegel considered Kant's basic failing to be an inability to see that the limits of reason are self-legislated, so that when intelligibility is absolutely consummated the ethical order is recognized as commanding for nature. Spirit must abandon itself to its noumenal extinction in the confidence that it cannot be identified with its perishable pupal stages, but instead finds eternal life in the thinkability of death. Finitude is only possible through a spiritual production transcending and comprehending it as a necessary moment of itself. Humanity becomes God in the mode of a return by expiating its finitude on the cross of history, whereby alterity is neutralized into the reconciliatory phenomenology of absolute spirit equals God. So much for the novelty of the Hegelian imagination. Since Hegel the word phenomenology has fallen even further into disrepute. Compared to the majestic pomp of the Hegelian system, the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, with which the word phenomenology is now inextricably tangled, is a neo-Kantian eccentricity. There is something profoundly infantile about the egocentric obsession of Husserlian thought. One is reminded of Fichte. It is only worth mentioning at all because primarily for socio-political reasons, it has not been without defenders. If in the Hegelian mode of philosophizing alterity is reduced into a collective auto-generative knowing, in the Husserlian mode it is reduced into a monadic transcendental ego, at the limit a petty bourgeois parody of Hegel's absolute God in the guise of a minor state employee, for which the Kantian noumenon is bracketed as a transcendent or naturalistic postulate. The transcendence of the object is reconstituted on the side of the subject as the intentionality or inherently outward-oriented character of experience. Experience is intrinsically transcended, that is to experience something as an experience of something beyond the experience itself is simply what experience is in itself. That thought concerns something outside itself is a transcendental structure of thought. Rigorous phenomenology of the Husserlian type, whereby all questions of reference are replaced by an analytic of intentionality, leads straight to idealism and solipsism and thus, as Schopenhauer persuasively suggests, to the madhouse, although it is an insipid insanity they offer us. An altogether richer vein of thought is that initiated by Schelling, provoking Hegel's famous remark concerning a night in which all cows are black. Like Hegel, Schelling saw the weak spot of Kantianism to lie in the impossibility of a rigorous determination of the transcendental ground of knowing, since what is transcendental has to remain immanent to its own disjunction. What differentiates these two philosophical modes is that where Hegel's Aufbung or assimilatory negation passes through the other, appropriating it as a mediating pause of absolute reason, Schelling's Indifference undercuts the articulated terms, exacerbating the critical gesture, since one of the transcendentally subverted terms is in each case the simulacrum of the transcendental. Hegelian thought is guided by the exigency of comprehension, which at their limit grounds itself, Schelling's by that of transcendental grounding, which at the limit comprehends all difference. In their early 19th century systematic forms these types of thinking can seem very similar, but as they divergently concretize themselves into contemporary philosophies of critical theory and deconstruction respectively, their difference becomes more stark. The most important rhetorical symptom of this difference is the contrast between an ever more nostalgic discourse on the failure of totality on the one hand, and an ever more complacently impotent discourse on the impossibility of radical subversion on the other. In their recent forms both discourses make frequent and preposterous claims to a Nietzschean inspiration. It is not Hegel or Schelling who provide Nietzsche with a philosophical taproot, but rather Schopenhauer. With Schopenhauer the approach to the noumenon as an energetic unconscious begins to be assembled, and interpreting the noumenon as will generates a discourse that is not speculative, phenomenological, or meditative, but diagnostic. It is this type of thinking that resources Nietzsche's genealogy of inhuman desire, which feeds in turn into Bataille's base materialism, for which noumenon is addressed as impersonal death and as unconscious drive. Even though Bataille exhibits little interest in Schopenhauer, and even a measure of casual hostility, his location in relation to the history of philosophy cannot be pursued without attending to the meditation upon the will that Schopenhauer initiated. Kant's conception of the will, provides a certain baseline for the thought of desire because it is the sophisticated rendering of a crudity. The folk psychology of intentions finds a baroque justification in Kant's philosophy, but scarcely even the most fleeting interrogation. Kant rationalizes willing into transcendental agency, the more or less lucid pursuit of ends, exhaustively mediated by the structures of individualized representational subjectivity. Humanism reaches its zenith in such thinking, where the will is conceived as the condition of possibility for the efficiency of concepts, the wholly miraculous adaptation of transcendent reality to representation. With Schopenhauer this notion of will inherited from Kant and early German idealism undergoes a profound transformation. Such terms as will to power, libido, and orgone, for instance, can be seen to negotiate with the terminology of Kantianism only after their specifically Schopenhauerian modulation has been recognized. Schopenhauer no longer understands the spontaneity of will as a predicate serving to differentiate the transcendental subject from the inertia of matter, as Kant does. Rather, the terminology of the will, desire, is guided through its first faltering steps towards a notion of increate matter. Schopenhauer reserves the word matter for the fundamental determination of objectivity within representation, which he distinguishes from the will, whereas later thinkers beginning with Nietzsche, and including Freud as well as Bataille, shift the sense of matter towards the substratum of appearances, impersonal, unconscious, and real, that Schopenhauer calls will. Increate matter is a translation of will or noumenon, a designation for the anti-ontology basic to any positively atheistic materialism. To say the world was not created is to deny there is a God, writes Hobbes in his Leviathan. Such a thought is at variance with the most prevalent scientific conception of matter only insofar as science has, despite many of its pronouncements, tended to be implicitly agnostic, or even theist, rather than virulently atheistic in tendency. Due to this dominant attitude, first systematized by Kant in his determination of theological ideas as postulates of practical reason, matter has continued to be implicitly conceived as ens creatum, distinguished from a creative being which is determined as an extrinsic spontaneity. Matter as ens creatum is essentially lawful, whilst increate matter is anarchic, even to the extent of evading the adoption of an essence. This is why Schopenhauer considers the principle of sufficient reason or logicality of being to have a merely superficial validity. Schopenhauer reverses the traditional relation between intellect and will, for which willing is the volitional act of a representing subject, and recasts the will as a pre-representational, blind impulse. His advance is nevertheless an extremely limited one in certain respects. He considers the anarchic character of the pre-ontological cosmic bedrock to be morally objectionable, and merely replaces its traditional theistic determination with an extrinsic moral principle of absolute negation. denial of the will. This anti-materialist dimension of his thinking can be seen as stemming from the requirement that unlawful beings should retain their, idealistically grounded, juridical potentiality for the condemnation of itself. Without rigorously interrogating the basic values of his moral heritage, he continued to associate that which is not God with radical imperfection and sin, so that unregulated will is thought of not as irresponsibility but as malice. Perhaps it should not surprise us to learn that Schopenhauer lent his opera glasses to a Prussian officer in 1848, in order, as Lukács tells us, that he should have a better view of the rioters at whom he was shooting. Pessimism, or the philosophy of desire, has a marked allergy to academic encompassment. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud all wrote the vast bulk of their works from a space inaccessible to the sweaty clutches of state pedagogy, as, of course, does Butale. The most perfectly distilled attack upon institutional philosophy is probably that found in Schopenhauer's Per Ager and Paralipomena, in its section entitled On University Philosophy. By the end of this text, Schopenhauer has argued that the university is inextricably compromised by the interests of the state, that this necessarily involves it in the perpetuation of the monotheistic dogmas that serve such interests, and that the consequent subservience to vulgar superstition completely devastates it, degrading it to a grotesquely hypocritical sophistry, fueled by a petty careerism spiced by an envious hatred of intellectual independence, and articulated in a wretchedly obscure and distorted jargon that allows its proponents both to squirm away from the surveillance of the priests, and to hypnotize a gullibly adoring public. It is scarcely surprising that he comes to conclude, if there is to be philosophy at all, that is to say, if it is to be granted to the human mind to devote its loftiest and noblest powers to incomparably the weightiest of all problems, then this can successfully happen only when philosophy is withdrawn from all state influence. This distaste has been fully reciprocated. One need only take note of Heidegger's remarks on Schopenhauer to get a taste of the university's revenge upon its assailants. The crass dismissal of Schopenhauer's aesthetics in the first volume of Heidegger's Niat lectures is a quite typical example, and others can be found in Introduction to Metaphysics, Hizlbner's lectures, What is Called Thinking, etc. What is at stake in both cases is not argument, however rancorous, but the relation of mutual revulsion between the academy and a small defiant fragment of its outside. Neither recognizes the legitimacy of the other's discourse, for the university considers its other to be incompetent, whilst the part of this other, admittedly a very small part, that has seized and learned to manipulate the weaponry of philosophical strife, considers the /oi of the university to be irremediably tainted by servility. Little progress can be made in interpreting this conflict so long as one remains attached to idealistic notions of controversy or debate. The constitution of debates is the dominant mode of pacification employed by the university, the validation of certain manageable conflicts within the context of institutionalization, moderation, and the indefinite deferral of consequences. What is transcendental to academic debate is submission to socio-economic power. It might even be fair to suggest that it is Schopenhauer who first spoils the possibility of debate in this case, that Heidegger, for instance, is already provoked. The famous story about Schopenhauer setting his lectures at the same times as Hegel would be an example of this, a dramatization of the relation of exclusion that is at least as basic to the university as dialogue. Anybody who dismisses this gesture as mere perversity is lending implicit credence to the notion that the university gives each a chance to speak, providing a neutral space for the encounter of divergent types of thought. Schopenhauer does not take any such suggestion of academic impartiality seriously. The state has at all times interfered in the philosophical disputations of the universities and has taken sides, no matter whether it was a question of realists and nominalists, or Aristotelians and Ramists, or Cartesians and Aristotelians, of Christian Wolff, Kant, Fichte, Hegel, or anything else. Furthermore, the intervention of the state is a perpetually operative force that is immanent to the institution itself. University philosophy polices itself as part of its sordid flirtation with state power. It never occurs to a professor of philosophy to examine a new system that appears to see whether it is true, but he at once tests it merely to see whether it can be brought into harmony with the doctrines of established religion, with government plans, and with the prevailing views of the times. After all this he decides its fate. By precipitating a non-dialogical collision with Hegel, Schopenhauer certainly demonstrated a measure of tactical ineptitude, but not strategic blindness. For it is difficult to imagine that anyone would want to suggest that an impartial space for the discussion of atheistic philosophy was available at the University of Berlin during the early 1820s. The power of Schopenhauer's diagnosis is that it is able to attend simultaneously to both the metaphysical conflict between philosophy and monotheism and the institutional forestalling of this conflict. This amphibiousness invests his critique of optimism with an enduring energy of dissent. Optimism is the general form of apology, at once the key to the metaphysical commitments of theology and the protection of these commitments from vigorous interrogation. Monotheism, with its description of the world as the creation of a benevolent God, or at least, of a God that defines the highest conception of the good, Jewsifies an all-pervasive optimistic framework for which being is worthy of protection. For the optimist revolt, critique, and every form of negativity must be conditioned by a projected positivity. One criticizes in order to consolidate a more certain edifice of knowledge, one revolts in order to establish a more stable and comfortable society, one struggles against reality in order to release being into the full positivity which is its due. All of which inevitably slows things down a great deal, because, unless one has a persuasive plan of the future, negativity is delegitimated by a prior apologetic dogma. The suggestion is always that at least this is better than nothing, a slogan that some Leibnizian demon has probably scrawled above the gates of hell, not that I have any argument with hell. Whilst speculative thought is the logic of social progress, a realization of freedom by means of a gradual absorption of conditions into the collective subject of political action, pessimism is the effect process of unconditional revolt. The most bleak speculative reasoning still retains a commitment to the reality of progressive development, even if this is momentarily frozen into the implicit truth of an agonizing contradiction. If Adorno creates particular difficulties for such a contention, it is because he creates equivalent difficulties for speculative thought, partly because he is abnormally sensitive to the irreducible ethnocentrism involved in Hegel's thinking, an ethnocentrism which is related to, although ultimately more interesting than, the colonial triumphalism of his philosophy of history. Its basic character is a terror of regression to a primitiveness that would forsake the laborious advances of one's Occidental ancestors, and this is in turn a symptom of the wretched Western nihilism that insists one has an immense amount to lose. That our history has been in any way beneficial is something Schopenhauer vigorously repudiates, and his vehement anti-historicism, which Nietzsche comes to massively overhaul, has at least this merit: it sets itself firmly against one of the basic apologetic motifs of Occidental societies. After all, we cannot use the word history without meaning a singular process that one population has inflicted on several others, as well as upon its own non-servile virtualities, a process that has combined gruesome accident with sustained atrocity. The speculative model of revolution is one of taking over, the pessimistic model is one of escape, on the one hand the overthrow of oppression as exploitation, and on the other the overthrow of oppression as confinement. Employing an ultimately untenable distinction, it could be said that at the level of social description these models are at least as complementary as they are exclusive. The extraction of labor power and the inhibition of free movement have been complicit in the domestication of the human animal since the beginning of settled agriculture. But at the level of strategy a certain bifurcation begins to emerge, leading Deleuze and Guattari, for instance, to tease apart a Western and an Eastern model of revolution, the latter being based on a block of partially repressed nomad desire, oriented to the dissolution of sedentary space and the liquidation of the state. 3. Of course, insofar as one is concerned with anything like a directly applicable concrete program, Schopenhauer has little to offer. What is known of his politics has a definite reactionary slant, and he does not seem to have grasped either the chronic exterminatory tendencies of settled societies, or their deep arbitrariness. The alternative he proposes is one of departure in the mode of renunciation, which is to say, he lacked a nomadology, or failed to explore the delirial anti-logic that leads out of the maze. This is a claim at the same level as that which accuses Hegel of lacking a convincing account of the specifically modern dominion of commodity production, and helps to explain the impulse to the concrete associated with Nietzsche and with Marx. Pessimism is not a value logically separable from an independent metaphysics, because the logical value of identity is itself a comfort of which pessimism destitutes us, whilst a metaphysics of the will subverts the autonomy or separability of value questions. In this sense, pessimism is the first truly transcendental critique, operated against being, and in particular against the highest being, by the impersonal negativity of time or denial. Schopenhauerians and Hegelians can travel a considerable distance together in submitting being unsparingly to its abolition in time, although, in the end, speculative thought exhibits a fear of regression that looks to a pessimistic perspective like an anti-primitivist ideology, serving the interests of pseudo-progressive Western societies. Marx's famous appeal to the working class in the Communist Manifesto that they have nothing to lose but their chains is open to both a speculative and a pessimistic interpretation, and it is perhaps the latter that unleashes its most uncompromising force. Part of Kant's legacy is that no important philosopher since his time has considered tradition JTL theism to be theoretically defensible. Kant's critique of pure reason methodically dismantles the structure of argument for the existence of God that had been painstakingly constructed by the scholastic and early modern philosophers, the most important pillars of which had been the ontological, cosmological, and teleological proofs, all of which Kant showed to be radically untenable. Although no significant philosopher has contested Kant's thorough demolition of these apologetic arguments, they have responded to it in a number of distinct ways. Kant's own path was the refoundation of theistic belief in faith guided by moral necessity. Religion became subordinate to the immediate evidence of moral law. The post-Kantian idealists, amongst whom the most notable are, of course, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, all sought to reconstruct theology on the basis of speculative reason, for which the imagery of Christian monotheism served as something between ornamentation and evidence of a groping historical anticipation. For these thinkers the authority of the Kantian text had become inestimably more authoritative than Judeo-Christian scripture, whatever their pious declarations to the contrary. Jacobi, Kierkegaard, and others sought an ultra-fideism in which the absurdity of religious belief was transmuted into a positive challenge, whilst Schopenhauer, followed by Nietzsche, concluded that philosophy must become savagely atheistic. Schopenhauer was not a reluctant atheist. He considered monotheism to be not merely erroneous, but grotesque. Many elements are involved in this judgment, but the most important, both for his thought and later for Nietzsche's, is the violent repudiation of the massively anthropocentric tendency of such faiths, which he interpreted anti-Semitically. A central and insistent tenet of Schopenhauer's philosophy is that intellect, personality, and consciousness are extremely superficial and derivative characteristics of complex nervous systems, and are thus radically untypical of the nature of the cosmos, which is driven by impersonal and unconscious forces. Even in the human being, personality was nothing but an ephemeral foam, almost incidental to its basic life functions, and instrumental in the service of these latter. Furthermore, the personality was not a reason for celebration, but rather a wound, or a gore-spattered cell in which the futile horror of existence was exhibited as squalid suffering, and occasionally, in a few select specimens, as tragedy. The notion of a personal God was therefore a monstrous perversion born of egoism and blindness, an attempted justification of individuated conscious existence that pandered to the miserable vanity of those in flight from the only possibility of redemption, the annihilation of self. In contradistinction from Kant, therefore, Schopenhauer considered theism to be the apotheosis of immorality, a wretched attachment to the principle of personal identity. Nietzsche wholeheartedly subscribed to the basic tenets of Schopenhauer's diagnosis, but sought to deepen his cosmology, and to jettison the residual egoism that lay in its continued obsession with redemption. Nietzsche no longer considered the sufferings of the self to be a serious objection to the basic cosmic processes that underpinned it. Where Schopenhauer had depicted the unconscious striving of nature as a will to live, whose most sophisticated form is the egoism of the individuated human animal, Nietzsche renamed this fundamental drive the will to power, for which survival is a mere tool. For Nietzsche, life is thought of as a means in the service of an unconscious trans-individual creative energy. Mankind as a whole is nothing but a resource for creation, a dissolving slag to be expended in the generation of something more beautiful than itself. The end of humanity does not lie within itself, but in a planetary artistic experiment about which nothing can be decided in advance, and which can only be provisionally labeled Overman. For Overman is not a superior model of man, but that which is beyond man, the creative surpassing of humanity. Nietzsche read Christianity as the nadir of humanistic slave morality, the most abject and impoverishing attempt to protect the existent human type from the ruthless impulses of an unconscious artistic process that passed through and beyond them. The mixture of continuity and discontinuity connecting Nietzsche's atheism with Schopenhauer's is encapsulated in Nietzsche's maxim, "Man is something to be overcome." Nietzschean theology is relentless anti-humanism, which has led to it being confused with another, quasi-anti-humanistic philosophy, the deconstruction of Jacques Derrida, a philosopher who has exercised a hegemonic power over but ill reception in recent years. The immediate roots of deconstruction lie in the phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger, and with the later work of Heidegger, in particular, it has an almost total intimacy. The dominant motif of this entire current of thought is presencing, or Anwesenheit, the event through which the phenomenon is given, associated with the operation of language. the axial insight of the later Heidegger and then Derrida, an insight that displaces Kant's critique whilst remaining structurally analogous to it, is that presencing has been traditionally conceived on the model of presence. This is to say, the origin of the phenomenon has been conceived on the basis of the phenomenon itself, so that presencing is thought through that which it constitutes. 0 as both Heidegger and Derrida come to conclude, fails to constitute. Derrida's well-known terms writing, text, difference, etc., refer to a process of the constitution of presence that is never consummated, an interminable generative non-presence. He often describes this process in terms that echo, in an anemic fashion, Nietzsche's will to power, an insatiable creative drive, perpetually dissolving its products back into itself in an artistic frenzy without end. But such resonances do not indicate any substantive philosophical relation. The phenomenological tradition, with its fetish of awareness, is quite alien to the philosophies of the energetic unconscious that row in a tightly compacted series from Kant, through Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, to Freud. There is an immense gulf between Nietzsche's aggressive genealogies that wreck unity on zero, and Derrida's deconstructed phenomenology that interminably probes the border between presence and absence. Deconstructive readings are undertaken almost exclusively against the most elementary structures of signification, the binary distinction. Such readings focus upon a text whose conceptual architecture is of this dichotomous or oppositional kind, the claim being that this is in any case an ubiquitous characteristic of Western writing. The binary order of the concept is considered to be the ultimate basis of the myth of phenomenality, the imposition of a spurious clarity, distinctness, and coherence whose principle is the logical law of the excluded middle. For Derrida, in superficial agreement with Hegel's phenomenology of reason, identity and negation are both modes of presence. Derrida's twist is to suggest that the excluded middle, or the difference between identity and non-identity, is never successfully excluded, but is rather subject to a failed repression. The reason for this, to outline it very sketchily, rests on a principle shared by thinkers as various as Spinoza, Hegel, and Saussure, that presence is a contrastive concept. To be present is to have been rigorously differentiated from non-presence, which means that differentiation itself, since it is the condition of presence, is unpresentable. Since difference or non-presence cannot be lucidly represented, it is impossible for anything to be rigorously distinguished from it, which means that the conditions of presence are unrealizable. The task of deconstructive reading is the recovery of the written difference, which Derrida calls the trace, and which interferes with the constitution of identity and difference as lucid concepts. The procedure of deconstruction is to first reverse the traditional value hierarchy encrusted in the opposition of terms, and then to explicitly mark a third term, one that has been deployed within the text inconsistently. This third term derives its value from both sides of the opposition, operating as a partially concealed pseudo-concept with incoherent predicates. This term will be a name for presencing or writing, and its discovery consummates a given deconstruction. Although Derrida's work can be rather baffling at first, especially since his prose style has inherited a considerable dosage of Teutonic inelegance and obscurity, the implications of his machinery of reading for Nietzsche's atheological program are quite straightforward. He considers atheism to be at best a tactical step on the way to the deconstruction of theology, and in effect even this is a step he seems uninterested in. But even if Derrida were subject to an anti-theistic inclination, he could only be driven by his philosophy to search for that which institutes the difference between the presence and absence of God, something like Schelling's absolute or Heidegger's being, a search which is scarcely distinguishable from moves long familiar to radical theologians. Heidegger himself saw no contradiction between such a position and a continuing adherence to what is perhaps the most ideologically compromised variant of Christian belief, Southern German Roman Catholicism. Before examining Nietzsche's irreducibility to deconstruction a little more carefully, it is worth briefly introducing the arguments of Jean-François Noyes Lyotard, who even in his early Nietzschean stages caught up in a quasi-deconstructionist position on the question of atheism. There is no doubt that during the period ending in 1974 with Economie libidinale, Lyotard is far closer to Nietzsche's thought than Derrida has ever been, a symptom of which is Lyotard's attachment to psychoanalytical rather than phenomenological modes of inquiry. Nevertheless, even at this stage of his work, Lyotard disavows the space of atheism with a finality easily comparable with Derrida's. He considers atheism to be reactive, repeating a gesture of negation that belongs to theology rather than to the impulsions of an energetic unconscious which, as Freud argues, knows no negativity. What Nietzschean thought requires, he suggests, is a disinvestment of monotheism and not a critique of it. Christianity should not be attacked but abandoned, since atheism merely perpetuates the memory traces that foster the depressive states of resentment and disgust. Lyotard seeks to persuade his readers that the thought of the death of God merely dampens libidinal intensities if it is treated as anything other than a matter of indifference. God should bore us into forgetting rather than provoking us into revolt. What Derrida and Lyotard share, and where they both diverge from Nietzsche, is the supposition that atheism is an instance of negation, rather than a transmutation or transvaluation of its sense. For Nietzsche it is facile to accuse atheism of having a recourse to a notion of negativity which is itself essentially theological, because to do so is to remain passively within a socio-historically realized theological space that continues to organize the meanings of all terms. Negation is reforged in the celebration of the death of God, to mean the way in which God is not, and this is a sense which is incommensurate with the negation that was permitted within theology and the metaphysics conditioned by it. To say there is no God is not to express a proposition in a pre-established logical syntax, but to begin thinking again, in a way that is radically new, and therefore utterly experimental. Zero is fatally discovered beneath the scabrous crust of logical negativity. It is obscurantism of the most tediously familiar kind to suggest that the nothing of nihilism is an indissolubly theological concept. The nihil is not a concept at all, but rather immensity and fate. Nietzsche describes atheism as an open horizon, as a loss of inhibition. The A of atheism is privative only in the sense of a collapsing dam. Deconstruction is the systematic closure of the negative within its logico-structural sense. All uses, references, connotations of the negative are referred back to a bilateral opposition as if to an inescapable destination, so that every de, un, dis, or anti is speculatively imprisoned within the mirror space of the concept. If we were to follow deconstruction to the letter here, it would follow that atheism, anti-humanism, and anti-logic, far from being virulent pestilential swamps, had no force except through their determinate relations to their enemies, which had thus always already bilateralized them into docility. As for deconstruction itself, it likes to suffer. Such logicization of the negative leads to Derrida thinking loss as irreducible suspension, delay, or difference, in which decision is paralyzed between the postponement of an identity and its replacement. Suspension does not resolve itself into annihilation, but only into a trace or remnant that has always been distanced from plenitude, rather than deriving from it, so that difference is only loss in there, nonsense of irreparable expenditure insofar as this can be described as the insistence of an unapproachable possibility, which is to say, under the aegis of a fundamental domestication. In Freud and the CNF writing, Derrida is overt in his commensuration of difference with the reality principle, reading both as instances of the regulation of discharges. Difference channels the descent of affective quanta, rerouting them into a detour, which has always already begun, in order that their effects can be adapted to the exigency of repetition. In a peculiar series of moves, Derrida brands desire with a metaphysical inclination, shifting it from an energetic to a phenomenal tautological register, which then allows him to transcendentalize repression by aligning it with the impossibility of pure presence, and to implicitly juggle the thought of repression so that it becomes the repression of the acknowledgement of the necessity of repression, repression of writing as repression of impossible inclination. Thus he redoubles the epistemo-contemplative terms of diagnosis, valorizes the martyrdom of the ego, changes the signs of psychoanalysis whilst reinforcing its secondary process politics, attempts the elimination of all possible reference to a material, sacrificial, and generative unconscious that is beyond phenomenological recuperation, and, in general, produces one of the most coherent apologetics of libidinal vivisection ever written, all garbed in a spuriously subversive rhetoric. In terms of the social dissemination of his discourse, Derrida is perhaps our Hegel, an assimilator in the service of the great tradition of authoritarian reason and toothless academic professionalism, facilitated by the sophistication of problems into the philosophical stratosphere. Like Hegel, he is obsessed by the reference of all things to the concept, by oppositional relations, both profess to resist, redirect, struggle against them, representation, dependency, the saturating prevalence of logos, and capture. Their thinking also shares the unattractive characteristic of thriving upon the frustration of rupture and the sentimental pathos of overwhelming inheritance. Both conceive and practice revolt as a strategy of intelligent conservation. Both write in a ghoulish technical jargon squirming within a tortured syntax. Indeed, the most basic lesson Derrida learns from Heidegger, almost certainly unconsciously, is how to save the socio-political prestige which Hegel attains for philosophy, the reserve of secondary process apologetic, from the ludicrously over-emphatic idealism of speculative thought. The strategy adopted in both cases is essentially Kantian: if there is something you want to protect, attack it with measured vigor yourself, thus investing it with replenished force, and preempting its annihilation. If it is Heidegger who is the most successful practitioner of such conquest as the transfer of defensive responsibility, Derrida still remains his most eager disciple. Thus it is that the text of Western metaphysics finds itself subject to a general destruction, deconstruction, or restorative critique, which, amongst other things, fabricates it into a totality, rescues it from its own decrepit self-legitimations, generalizes its effects across other texts, reinforces its institutional reproduction, solidifies its monopolistic relation to truth, confirms all but the most preposterous narratives of its teleological dignity, nourishes its hierophantic power of intimidation, smothers its real enemies beneath a blizzard of pseudo-irritations, its unsaid or margins, keeps its political prisoners locked up, repeats its lobotomizing stylistic traits and sociological complacency, and, in the end, begins to mutter once more about an unnamable God. Deconstruction is like capital, managed and reluctant change. An important instance of pseudo-contact is found in Derrida's discussion of Nietzsche and femininity in Spurs, a text that serves as a supplement to Heidegger's interpretation of the will to power as art. This reading marks out some traits of Nietzsche's sexuality, a sexuality of and as writing, indicating a web of relations to the history and structure of logocentric metaphysics. The condensation of these remarks into a pointed proposition, a stylate form that is more frequent in Derrida's texts than many of his commentators imply, might generate something like this. Nietzsche's textuality is worked by a repressed lesbian stratum that subverts the traditional logic of truth and appearance. According to Derrida, the system of repression that partially dominates Nietzsche's writing is orchestrated by a principle of castration, having two moments, articulated as follows. He dreaded this castrated woman. He dreaded this castrating woman. Castration is determined in thought as a plenitude threatened by absence, of a plus and minus distributed by the law of the excluded middle. It is thus the fundamental psychological repercussion of metaphysics. Freud suggests in many places that it is this structure itself in its purest state, that has governed the construction of gender within Western history. Because castration is a matter of the distribution of a moment of pure and ultimate lack, it is readily associated with a problematic of disappropriation. Derrida reads this difference between having and not having as itself regulated by a more primordial propriative movement that cannot be characterized either by plenitude or lack. He takes this propriative difference to be a moment of deconstructive lesbian excess that he expresses in the phrase, he loved this affirming woman. In Nietzsche's text, as the unstable principle of its unfurling, can be found the figure of woman in love with herself. The logic of these movements closely parallels that of Heidegger's The Will to Power as Art lectures, for which the collapse of the truth, appearance opposition at the end of Nietzsche's How the True World at Last Became a Fable is celebrated as the breakdown of the repressive and unreformable dyadic scheme, a Herausdrehen, a twisting out or writhing free of metaphysics. Derrida somewhat surreptitiously inserts a figure of lesbian desire into this problematic, against the grain of the ponderous masculinity of Heideggerian prose, in order to mark the auto-affection of non-identity, or the asymmetric other of the phallus in touch with her, non-self. The compromises that box in this intervention are legion, since once again it is a difference between presence and absence that finally orchestrates it. That it retains a certain seductiveness stems from the fact that it partially captures a shift from bilateral reflection to unilateral propulsion that is profoundly consonant with Nietzsche's thinking, even though this shift is crushed into the border zone at the edge of a phenomenological determination of plenitude. Zero or the sacred is retained within the constriction of profane negativity, and religious fate is interpreted through the technical prowess of philosophy. At the end of a note from the late spring of 1888, numbered 811 in the compilation entitled The Will to Power, Nietzsche argues that a woman's aesthetics, biased towards the question of receptivity, have dominated our understanding of art. He suggests that one should not demand of the artist, who gives, that he becomes a woman, and receives. The production of art is characterized as masculine, whilst the reception of art, including the entire history of aesthetics, and even philosophy as a whole, is allotted to the feminine. Even though this unstable construction is a blatant efflorescence out of repression, since it collapses profligacy onto the polar terms of an exchange relation, constituting reciprocal or bilateral gender identities, it allows us to pursue Nietzsche's thinking about art into the inhuman squandering that guides and ruins it. Nietzsche provides us with some further markers into this abyss earlier in the same note, where he describes the artistic condition as follows. The extreme sharpness of certain senses, so they understand a quite different sign language, and create one, the condition that seems to be a part of many nervous disorders, extreme mobility that turns into an extreme urge to communicate, the desire to speak on the part of everything that knows how to give signs, a need to get rid of oneself, as it were, through signs and gestures, ability to speak of oneself through 100 speech media, an explosive condition. One must first think of this condition as a compulsion and urge to get rid of the exuberance of inattention through muscular activity and movements of all kinds, then as an involuntary coordination between this movement and the inner processes, images, thoughts, desires, as a kind of automatism of the whole muscular system impelled by strong stimuli from within, inability to prevent reaction, the system of inhibition suspended, as it were. And later, the compulsion to imitate, an extreme irritability through which a given model becomes contagious, a state is guessed on the basis of signs and immediately depicted, an image, rising up within, immediately turns into a movement of the limbs, a certain suspension of the will. Schopenhauer, a kind of deafness and blindness towards the external world, the realm of admitted stimuli is rigorously delimited. The artistic process is thus likened to a contagion and a nervous illness, an explosion of abreactive gestures with their associated intensities. The inhibition to this outflow collapses. But the admission of new material is sharply reduced. In other words, the powers of absorption are suppressed, anorexia is coupled with logorrhea, or extreme volubility, and art is thought on the basis of a violent wasting disease. There is a peculiar economic model at work here, in which a disequilibrium between expenditure and income is pushed towards its extreme. From a bourgeois perspective, what we are faced with is the ultimate form of dangerous madness, a process of anti-accumulation that is totally out of control. There are obvious difficulties in grasping the possibility of this economy due to the industrial tendency which denies that it could be basic. Chronic squandering violates the reciprocity which governs the logics of both Aristotle and Hegel, since it is incompatible with the principle that determination equals negation, according to which every loss is correlated with an associated gain. Both Aristotelians and Hegelians can become competent accountants, accepting the logical basis of double-entry bookkeeping, which is why bourgeois and Marxist economists are so often able to understand each other very easily. Nietzsche's remarks, on the contrary, tend to depart from intelligible human economy from the first. The demand in the will to power as art that one ought not to demand of the artist, who gives, that he should become a woman, evokes an episode from the history of how the true world at last became a fable. Progress of the idea, it becomes more delicate, seductive, unattainable, it becomes a woman, it becomes Christian. If this conjunction is read as saying it becomes a woman, and therefore becomes Christian, we can append much of Nietzsche's often ferociously anti-feminine rhetoric to this phrase. For instance, in another note gathered under the heading of the will to power as art from about this time, he writes, "What pleases all pious women, old or young? A saint with beautiful legs, still young, still an idiot." The problem with such a reading is that Christianity is an identitarian monotheism, insulated against zero, and a privileged graveyard of the sacred, burying the vortex of valve-cosmic dissolution beneath the monument of eternal being. Nietzsche is not trapped at the edge of a deconstruction, oscillating between presence and absence, but is rather scrabbling at the secondary process security of partial unity, fending off zero with the detritus of logical negation. If, as Derrida indicates, the pious woman is Nietzsche's synonym for the castrato, we can see that this figure is the opposite of the artist within a heavily revised delirium of wastage. A castrate capital that can only gorge itself and accumulate opposes the delirious anorexic maniac who throws away everything he has. But here we are back to reciprocal determination and double-entry bookkeeping, the condition of impossibility for art, in other words absolute capitalism. Castration distills a pure piety of engorgement that drives the artist into a proletarian destitution. Nietzsche is not unaware of this predicament, and in the passage that immediately precedes how the true world at last became a fable in Twilight of the Idols he writes, "To separate the world into the true and the apparent, be it in the Christian fashion, or in that of Kant, a cunning Christian to the end, is only a suggestion of decadence, a symptom of declining life. That the artist treasures appearance above reality is no objection to this proposition. Because here, appearance means reality once again, only selected, strengthened, corrected. The story traced by how the true world at last became a fable is that of our history, but it is a superficial process when compared to the prehistory that provides its resources and genealogical sense. The prehistorical narrative leads up to the events which the historical narrative presupposes, the suppression of the Dionysian impulse and its spontaneous flow of unredeemed expenditure into a rationality of conservation and opposition. This dawning of history is traced more fully in the note numbered number 584 in The Will to Power, a text of sustained power, including this one small fragment. And behold, suddenly the world fell apart into a true world and an apparent world, and precisely the world that man's reason had devised for him to live and settle in was discredited. Instead of employing the forms as a tool for making the world manageable and calculable, the deranged acuity of philosophers divined that in these categories is presented the concept of the world to which the one in which men's lives does not correspond. The means were misunderstood as measures of value, even as a condemnation of their real intention. The intention was to deceive oneself in a useful way, the means, the invention of formulas and signs by means of which one could reduce the confusing multiplicity to a purposive and manageable scheme. Where a cumulative reason has instituted truth and appearance as unsurpassable finalities or pure concepts, the artist understands appearance as reality once again. Reality returns in appearance like the ripple of a shock wave, opening wider and wider domains for migration. Since reality is itself the stimulus for such migrations, they will become progressively more devastating, as this stimulus becomes progressively selected, strengthened, corrected, or, to abbreviate, intensified. Here, at last, where nothing is last, is the convulsion of zero, eternal recurrence, the libidinal motor of Nietzsche's economics. Nietzsche's economy of the artistic process, or Dionysian economy, is built beneath the Vesuvian anti-logic of eternal recurrence. Such an economy is a perpetual re-emergence of inhuman squandering, an inappropriable excess messily exhibited in the transfiguration of negation into profligate zero. It is intrinsic to desire that it always has fresh and, when unmutilated by repression, increasingly sophisticated constructions to waste. A Dionysian economy is, indeed, a slash-and-burn agriculture of solar stock, in which the negative limit of each conceptual dyad is reconstituted as an intensification of the positive, as an increasing virulence of difference. The delirium of squandering flows from this inevitability that logical negation never arrives, even though zero impacts. In other words, the thought of eternal recurrence is this, that the abolition of integrated being in the process of desire, or unconstrained wastage, corresponds to an intensification of plagues, not a, logically intelligible, negation of assets. Epidemic difference is only enhanced by the spasmodic aberration from itself. A Dionysian economy is the flux of impersonal desire, perpetually re-energized in the pulse of recurrence, in the upsurge of new realities. These resurgent waves of intensity are situated at the point which patriarchal productivism had reserved for its limit, at the end of each becoming a woman, which are misconstrued as specific negations. Desire could thus be said to be nothing but becoming a woman at different levels of intensity, although of course, it is always possible to become a pious woman, to begin a history, love masculinity, and accumulate, because to become a woman is to depart from reality, and no one loves fables more than the church. But reality drifts upon zero, and can be abandoned over and over again. In the lesbian depths of the unconscious, desires for, as feminizing spasms of remigration are without limit. Everything populating the desolate wastes of the unconscious is lesbian, difference sprawled upon zero, multiplicity strewn across positive vulvic space. Masculinity is nothing but a shoddy bunghole from death. Socio-historically phallosan castration might be serious enough, but cosmologically they merely distract from zero, staking out a meticulously constructed poverty and organizing its logical displacement. If deconstruction spent less time playing with its willy, maybe it could cross the line.